Good morning, everyone. A warm welcome from BDB Pitmans. My name is Tom Henderson. I'm one of the partners here at BDB Pitmans. And for those of you who are not already familiar with us, we are a full-service law firm with offices in London, Cambridge, Reading, and Southampton. As many of you will know, we've been running our program of Business Breakfast for some years now, and we very much hope that we can return to the good old days when we can host you for these events in person and over breakfasts. The next time you do see us, it'll be at our new offices near Smithfield Market, and we're very much looking forward to showing you around. Turning to the subject of today's Business Breakfast webinar, it's the transition to net zero. And now, despite the enormous challenges thrown up by the coronavirus pandemic, and which has inevitably sucked in time and resources, for me, it's been illuminating and I guess heartening to see that the climate crisis has still remained pretty high on the public and political agenda over that time. And it feels like a crucial year in the ramping up of efforts to tackle the challenge. We've seen the change of administration in the US and the recent virtual summit hosted by Joe Biden. There's also been the recent step up in the UK's emissions reductions targets, which are world leading, of course. And this will culminate at COP26, the summit in Glasgow, later in the year. We're therefore delighted to introduce today's speaker on this topic, Tim Lord. Tim is a senior fellow at the Tony Blair Institute, where he leads on net zero and climate change. Tim has almost 20 years experience working on climate, energy and industrial policy, most recently as director responsible for the UK's decarbonisation strategy. So it'll be fascinating to hear Tim's perspectives on all of this. Before I hand over to Tim, some brief virtual housekeeping points. As is normal with these events, Tim will address us for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open things up for question and answer. So can I therefore encourage you to have a think about questions as we go along and submit any that come to mind through the Q&A function. And once we've concluded Tim's presentation, we'll move on to those. We've got about an hour allocated for the session, depending on how many questions we receive. The chat function is also enabled, but can I ask that you only use this if you're encountering technical difficulties, and we'll see if we can address those. Other than that, you'll see that your cameras and microphones are not enabled. So without further ado, over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Tom, and morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As you say, my background is that I'm currently the senior fellow in net zero for the Tony Blair Institute. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the net zero transition and what it means for both voters and businesses. And before that, I spent about 20 years in government in the UK working on climate and energy policy, including the last 3 years running the UK's decarbonisation strategy and running the team that set a net zero target. And I must say, it's a lot more fun doing these events these days when I'm allowed to say what I think. And certainly when I did events with lots of lawyers before, it was generally with the threat of a judicial review hanging over my head. So it's a pleasure to do it in slightly friendlier circumstances this time, although no doubt in the Q&A we might touch on some of those issues. The title of my remarks this morning is Change or Decline. And the reason for that title is because the net zero transition and therefore the global economy is, in my view, at an inflection point. And those who embrace that change are going to prosper, and those who don't are at risk of decline and ultimately failure. And what I'll do this morning is I'm basically going to cover four things. So the first is the kind of big picture on climate and net zero policy, particularly here in the UK. The second is about the pace of that transition and what's going to happen in the next 10 years in particular. The third is about the politics of the transition and some research that we've done looking at what it means politically. And then the fourth, what it means for businesses. And as you say, I'll talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then hopefully allow plenty of time for Q&A. So if I start with this chart, it might seem a little bit odd to start a presentation about change or decline with a chart that has basically a straight line on it. So this line is the percentage of global energy that we get from fossil fuels. And what this basically shows is that although it might feel like the last 30 years, you know, we've talked a lot about climate change, we've done a lot on climate change, what you actually see is that the share of energy coming from fossil fuels has stayed basically stable. It's come down from just under 90% to just over 80%. In the last 10 years, when we started talking about a climate emergency and we've had the Paris Agreement, it's come down by about 2.5%. And when you look at us here in the UK, it sort of feels like we've done a lot, and we have. We're the best performing country globally, certainly in the G20, in terms of the rate of our transition. So we've got, for example, coal power in 10 years ago was providing 40% of our electricity generation. Now it's providing 2%. Low carbon sources now provide over half of our electricity, and without bills having risen, I should mention. But in some ways, it's what hasn't changed over the last 10 years or even 30 years that's more notable. Because if I look back 10 years, we had a large centralized electricity generation infrastructure with consumers who weren't very responsive. And we've still basically got that. We've just swapped a load of coal plants for a lot of offshore wind. 10 years ago, we had over 80% of our homes on the gas grid using high carbon fuel to heat our homes. We've still got over 80% of our homes on the gas grid. Almost all our cars were petrol and diesel. They still are. We had no CCS in the UK. We still don't. We were having a long debate about whether we should build more nuclear power, and we still are. But while the last 10 years perhaps have been a lot of talk about change, but not a huge amount of real change in the UK or certainly globally, the next 10 years I don't think are going to look like that at all. And the first reason is because this line shows you what's happened to global temperatures on the right-hand axis, and they've risen quite significantly over the last 10 years. And all of the political pressure that you're starting to see around climate change has happened with that roughly half a degree of warming. But we're on track for another half degree in the next 5 to 10 years to hit 1.5 degrees not long after that as well. So that pressure is going to continue rising. But I think also that the broader social context has changed. So first of all, what we've seen is lots of public action around climate change. So we've seen the school strike for climate action led by Greta Thunberg. We've seen the Extinction Rebellion protests. One of the other great things about leaving government is I don't have to worry about Extinction Rebellion protesters doing themselves to the front of my building, hopefully, in my new job, which became rather habitual when working on climate for the UK government. So you've seen that sort of groundswell of political pressure. Now, a lot of people will say, yeah, but that's basically young, urban, middle class, metropolitan people. Actually, when we look at the data across society, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a bit, what you've seen is actually that the levels of concern around climate change, that's the dark blue line and then the grey line on this chart, have risen very significantly over the last 10 years. And what we've also seen is that the decline in that concern that happened after the 2008 financial crisis, when one assumes people thought there were more important things to worry about, hasn't happened in response to the coronavirus pandemic. So the public are really concerned about this. And what you've seen is the political response to that. So just in the last week, obviously, there was the Biden-led Earth Day summit. We've seen the UK setting a net zero target, which I'll talk more about. We've seen Japan, China, South Korea, the European Union, the US, all setting those targets. So you're seeing the political pressure and the science and the rate of temperature change leading to real action from politicians in terms of the ambition of the targets that they're setting. And then crucially, and again, I'll talk more about this as I go through, you've seen that the economics of net zero fundamentally changing. So we've seen batteries come down about 90% in a decade. We've seen solar, the cost of solar electricity generation come down by about 90% in a decade. We've seen the cost of offshore wind here in the UK halving in about 5 years or so. So what was a debate about, is it worth spending this huge amount of money and additional cost in order to address climate change, is fundamentally changing as those costs come down. And here in the UK, I said about us increasing our ambition. And what this chart shows is how we've done that. So the light blue bar at the top is what our targets were literally a couple of years ago. So back in before we set the net zero target, so as recently as 2019. And that dark blue line is what the targets look like now. So you can see we've come down an enormous amount. And in climate space, there's this hugely confusing number of percentages and gigatons and all that kind of stuff. And we baseline our targets here in the UK against 1990, which is also pretty confusing. You can remember what the world looked like in 1990. But when we look at our emissions now, or in 2019, so we leave 2020 out, that was a bit of an exceptional year. Basically, what we need to do here in the UK is cut our emissions by about 40% on current levels by 2030, by about 60% by 2035, and then by 100% by 2050. And that is a huge economic and social transition. So just briefly, kind of how do you get there? And I don't worry too much about all the colors on this chart, but basically what this shows is our emissions in 2019, so a bit over 500 million tons of CO2 emitted by the UK in 2019, and then what 2050 will look like. And obviously there's lots of different options about how you get to net zero, but fundamentally there aren't really that many options. Essentially what you have to do is reduce emissions by as far as you can in any sector where you can. What you'll then find is that in 2050 you've got some emissions that are left over that you can't really deal with. So first of all from agriculture, and secondly from international aviation and shipping, because there is really a credible technology pathway to fully decarbonize either of those sectors. And then you build a bunch of greenhouse gas removals, things like direct air capture, which sucks carbon out of the air in order to offset that. So it's actually pretty simple. And I think often people say, well, it's hugely complex in terms of how you get to net zero. In some ways, it's not really that complex at all. And when you get under the skin of what it looks like, I won't go through this chart line by line, but the point I wanted to make was that actually some of the changes that we talk about here aren't necessarily all that fundamental. Some of them are huge, but some of them not quite as big. So what does net zero for the UK look like? Well, it probably means we're going to need a lot more electricity. So at the moment, we use about 300 terawatt hours of electricity a year. That's going to rise to 460 terawatt hours and then over 600 probably by 2050. And what you also find is that by 2035, you basically have a zero carbon power system, because that has to be the sector that moves first. If we look at some of the big infrastructure in that sector, offshore wind, huge UK success story. We've got about 10 gigawatts of offshore wind, the most in the world now. We're going to need 50 by 2035. So you're going to need to build roughly 3 to 4 gigawatts a year. That's a lot. And then you're going to need something like 95 to 100 gigawatts in 2050. When we look at transport, about 2% of our cars in 2019 were battery electric. That's going to need to be 100% of new cars by 2035, and then consistently on from that. But then if you look at something like air travel, there's often a kind of convention that, well, we get to net zero, we all have to stop flying anywhere. Actually, when you look at what the Committee on Climate Change have said, we currently travel about 11,700 kilometers a year. That can drop, that'll need to drop a little bit for 2035, 11,400, but then potentially it could rise a bit after that as you decarbonize some of the fuels that we use. Then you get into sectors of the economy where this probably is a bit harder. So in our homes, for example, we currently install about 26,000 heat pumps a year. And I mentioned earlier, 80% of us are on the gas grid. That's going to need to rise to about 1.5 million a year by 2035, essentially the same as we install boilers at the moment as boilers break and so on. And it's going to need to be pretty consistent from there. So essentially, you've got about 29 years to decarbonize 29 million homes. That is an enormous challenge. In industry, we need to move away from, in particular, coal use and high carbon fuel use to electricity and hydrogen. We need to build an entire new sector in hydrogen production. So if you look at that figure in 2050, over 200 terawatt hours of hydrogen from basically zero now. And you think our electricity usage is 300 terawatt hours at the moment. You can see the kind of scale that we're talking about there. In terms of our diet, there's been some talk this week that net zero requires us to cut 90% of our meat from our diets by 2030. That's completely rubbish. You probably ideally need your meat consumption to come down a bit, although the government has said that it's not going to focus on that, and I think for probably quite sensible political reasons. But we can still eat red meat, we can still eat dairy. Ideally, we'd eat a bit less. And then we've got land use, and land use is going to need to change quite a bit. We're going to need a lot more forests, we're going to need a lot more bioenergy, and finally, we're going to need a huge amount of carbon capture and storage. One of the interesting things about net zero, as opposed to our old 80% target, is that we're going to need tens of megatons, so tens of millions of tons of carbon capture, 104 million by 2050 in order to offset those remaining emissions. So it is a big challenge, but it's also not an inconceivably big challenge, and the technologies largely are there to help us do it. On the kind of context section, it's worth saying a little bit about what does this really mean, or what do you have to do to get there. And the key challenges are basically twofold. One is behavior change, for getting consumers and businesses to do the things we need them to do, whether it's buying a little bit less, whether it's eating a little bit less red meat, whether it's installing heat pumps in their homes. But the key challenge is investment. And this is a chart from the Climate Change Committee's advice on the net zero target. And basically what this shows is that our investment rises above the line to about £50 billion a year to decarbonise the economy. But below the line, you're getting a lot of savings as a result of that. So for example, fuel savings on transport, it currently costs you about 15 pence a mile in fuel to drive your petrol or diesel car. That costs about 5 pence a mile for an electric vehicle. So overall, this kind of nets off, broadly speaking, but some of the savings come later than some of the expenses, and some of the capital expenditure is really significant. And I think in some ways, the key policy challenge around net zero is how do you design the policy instruments that will enable that private sector investment to flow. So if I move on now, having sort of set the scale of the challenge to why I think the pace of that is going to increase significantly. I quite like this analogy when we think about what's happening with the net zero transition. This is Michael Liebreich, who's a commentator and an entrepreneur in the energy space. And his analogy is the sneeze. At the first 1% of this transition in particular sectors, 5% is like waiting for a sneeze. We all know that feeling where you know it's inevitable, it takes longer than you think. And then 5 to 50% happens incredibly quickly. And my view is that we're on the cusp of the sneeze, of the 5 to 50% across the economy, really. And I was going to illustrate that with 3 sectors. So if we look first of all at electric vehicle sales. So 10 years ago, electric vehicles basically were not a desirable consumer position. They looked kind of like the Duplo toys my kids play with, but now they are a desirable consumer proposition. Cost has come down really significantly. And here in the UK, we recently sold more electric vehicles in 12 months than in the previous 10 years combined. In Germany, the share of battery electric vehicles went from 4% in December 19 to 26% in December 2020. And this chart here shows the kind of global deployment of low carbon vehicles. And it's basically got that vertical line of deployment happening. And we've seen a lot of vertical lines on graphs over the last year of the pandemic. Generally speaking, they've been bringing bad news. I think this one brings pretty good news actually, and shows that this transition is going to start happening really quickly. The second example that I'd use is, sorry, before I move on to my second example, this is one of my favorite slides, which is the answer to people who say this transition can't happen all that quickly because of the infrastructure or whatever, because this is 2 pictures of the Easter Day Parade in New York City in 1900. Spot the car, and I've helped you out with a red circle on the left. All the rest are horse-drawn carriages, and then on the right, literally 13 years later, spot the horse. And there isn't a red circle on this one because horse-drawn transport had completely gone. And you know, as people say, you know, if you'd ask people in 1900 what you want, they'd have said faster horses. But by 1913, that transition had happened, and I think we're on the cusp of something similar in the transportation space now. Now, the second example is on renewable deployment. Now, I showed you a chart earlier about the global share of energy coming from fossil fuels, but what we're seeing now with renewable deployment is that is going to change, and it's going to change pretty quickly. So this is global wind power generation in terawatt hours. The numbers don't matter that much. What's important, of course, is the shape of the graph. And as I mentioned earlier, the UK has been a leader in this, in particular in offshore wind. And I remember 20 years ago, the first visit I did when I worked for the government was to the first ever offshore wind site in the UK, which was basically 2 wind turbines off the coast of Blyth in Northumberland. They were basically onshore wind turbines, quite small, plonked in the sea. You could swim out to them if you were a better swimmer than me. Now we're deploying 1-2 gigawatt enormous industrial scale offshore wind sites, and as I say, up to 10 gigawatts. But the total wind capacity in the UK is about 25 gigawatts. China deployed that amount in 1 year alone last year. So you're seeing that transition happening not just here in the UK, but globally, whether it's Chinese wind, Turkish solar, UK offshore wind. That graph is going to continue going upwards at this kind of rate. And then the third example I'll use is about basically following the money. So this chart shows the price to earnings ratio for Shell and BP at the bottom, and I'm not picking on them. I could have used a number of other fossil fuel oil and gas companies, and those price to earnings ratio is pretty flat over the last couple of years. And then you look at someone like Ørsted, which is the Danish, previously the Danish oil and natural gas company, so big publicly owned utility. They pivoted completely to renewables, and you can see what investors think about that transition. And then in the pink line, you've got Vestas, so a big manufacturer in the renewable space, and a very similar phenomenon happening. And when we look at something like, I mentioned electric vehicles earlier, look at Tesla. Tesla at the end of last year was worth more than the next 9 automotive companies combined. And what you're seeing now is the market responding very, very quickly to that. So you've seen Volvo, you've seen General Motors, you've seen Ford, all committing to go fully electric in the next 10 to 15 years. And it's really playing out in the energy space as well. So there was reports last week that to invest in coal now, investors are expecting 4 times the level of returns that they want on renewables projects because of the level of risk attached to them. So I think for all 3 of those examples, this transition is going to happen very, very quickly. If I move on now to the third area that I said I'd touch on. So this is about the politics of this transition, because a lot of the transition we've seen so far has basically happened kind of behind the scenes. So consumers haven't really noticed. Still flick your light switch and it comes on. You don't really care where the electrons came from. But the next phase of this transition, as I mentioned earlier, is going to impact on people in a very, very different way. And the politics of that, I think, are about to get quite complex. And what we wanted to do with this piece of work was basically to test a few theories. The first was that there's a stable political consensus around climate change in the UK, because you can look back and say the Climate Change Act passed with support from all sides of the House. I think only 6 MPs voted against it back in 2008. When we put the net zero target into law, I was sat in the officials box in the House of Commons next to the Speaker's chair for the legislative debate on that. That was probably the biggest bit of legislation that we've passed in the last 10 years, and I include Brexit legislation in that. The debate on it was about an hour and a half long and basically consisted of politicians from all parties saying what a wonderful idea it was and how we needed to get on with it very quickly, but no at all really about what it meant. I think the other preconception that we were testing was that this is, as I mentioned before, a kind of young, urban, middle-class, metropolitan agenda, as opposed to one which plays into the concerns of voters across the country. So when we looked at that, this is what I showed before, I won't linger on it. What we've seen is climate change concern has increased a lot over time. It hasn't fallen in response to the coronavirus pandemic. But what we can then do is look under the skin of that and look at it on a demographic basis. And what we found there was really interesting, which is that 10 years ago, we look at the chart in the top left on age. 10 years ago, it was kind of true that young people were a lot more concerned about climate change than older people. So there's about 15% gap there. Whereas what you see when you move to the right of that chart in 2020 and 2021 is that that gap has closed. Older people have got more concerned more quickly than younger people. And what you now see is over 80% of people population concerned about climate change. That's kind of comparable to the percentage of the population that think the NHS is a good thing. This is a very, very high and unusually high level of consensus. And then when you look at that across other parts of the economy, income or social grade or urban versus rural, you see very, very similar phenomenon. So there isn't a big demographic split around concern on climate change. So great, you might think, if you're a politician, this is fantastic, everyone's really put into this, let's get on with it. But there are a couple of notes of caution. So the key thing that we also looked at was analysing on the basis of values. And traditionally, political science in the UK is focused on the left-right split. So what are voters' views on an economic basis, on the role of the state, etc. And what we found there was actually there isn't much of a split at all. The other thing that people have done a lot more of in the last couple of years, in particular in response to the Brexit vote and analysing that, is looking at the open close or the liberal authoritarian axis. And this is people's views on a wider range of social issues. And it was a very, very good predictor of the Brexit vote. And what we see there is that there's a much, much bigger split on levels of concern. So open voters, people who are perhaps more metropolitan, if you like, in their outlook, have a much more favourable view towards action on climate change. They're much more concerned about it, whereas voters with closed or more authoritarian views, very different. So why does that matter? Well, I think for a couple of reasons. The first is that it echoes the Brexit divide. And it's probably fair to say Brexit was pretty divisive in the UK political system. I don't think that's terribly controversial. The open, closed or liberal authoritarian divide was a very good predictor of voter behaviour on that, much better than demographics or left-right economic views. And we see views on climate echoing that, not quite as divided yet, but certainly very, very comparable in comparison to other issues. And then the other thing that we're seeing is that the parties are moving away from one another. And so that consensus or perceived party consensus around climate is at risk of fracture. It's still there now, but it is at risk. So what you've seen is that Labour's voting base between 2015 and 2020 moved much more to the left of this chart, so much more towards the open voter, and the Conservative voter base moved much towards the right of this chart, or the more closed or authoritarian attitudes among voters. And that's particularly important because the voters who switched between the parties tended to be on this basis. This was a very good predictor for voter switching. So what you see is a Conservative base, which is much more closed or authoritarian, if you like, in the jargon in its outlook, and a Labour base that's much more open and liberal. And what that means is that politicians are going to need to think really, really carefully about how they present this agenda. So is it inevitable, therefore, that we have a kind of culture war around climate? Well, my view is, first of all, we haven't got time for that. But secondly, that it isn't inevitable. And there are things that politicians can do to address all of this. So particularly, very briefly, around strengthening public understanding. So at the moment, voters don't really understand what they need to do for net zero. Half of voters don't even realise that their home heating systems contribute to climate change, for example, even though it's almost certainly one of the biggest parts of their carbon footprint. So we need to get people's understanding up. I can't, and politicians can't expect people to get heat pumps unless they understand why they're being asked to. Secondly, that the framing matters. So how you communicate the rationale for action to appeal to different groups of voters is really important. And you might have seen last week Boris Johnson talking about bunny huggers, and that this agenda isn't about politically correct bunny huggers. And he raised a few eyebrows because he did that in the context of a major international conference with global leaders. But actually, I think in some ways the language that he's reaching for there is one that will resonate with voters beyond the normal kind of base of climate concern, and in other parts of society and in other parts of his voter base. And actually, in some ways, I think that's a sensible thing to be doing. The third thing is about patriotism and ownership. So what the climate movement tends to do is to focus on the sort of catastrophic impacts on climate change and global justice and so on. Those things are really important, and I'm not saying they're wrong to do that. You have to, I think, in order to bring voters with you, you have to have an appeal to kind of national mission and also a sense of local and community ownership around solutions. The next thing is about gaining and not losing. So as I said, we often present the climate issue as, if we don't do this, the whole world is going to be, catastrophically affected. And also that we have to give stuff up. So when I read the survey data, the questions are always, will you give up your gas boiler, your foreign holiday, your red meat in order to deliver this transition? And that is not going to resonate with voters. So how are you articulating the benefits? In particular, how are you delivering the jobs and the growth that go with that? Not simply in a kind of macroeconomic sense, in perhaps the way the Remain campaign articulated their case in the Brexit referendum, but in real investment in communities, in particular those that have suffered negative effects from previous transitions. And finally, it's about fairness. And when we talk about fairness in the climate space, we often talk about the poorest in society, both in the UK or the poorest countries globally. And that is a hugely important lens for all of this. Those people are least responsible for climate change, but they'll bear the brunt of the biggest impacts. But I think fairness needs to be seen much more broadly. It's not just about poorest voters, it's about the large number of people in the middle who don't necessarily feel wealthy, who don't feel they have a large amount of money to invest in addressing climate change, but who are absolutely critically important to building the political coalition that you need. Just to finish off, what does it mean for businesses? Well, I mean, there's probably quite a lot that I could say here, but I think there's three things that I would highlight. So the first is that economic and environmental sustainability go hand in hand. When we look at the coronavirus pandemic, often the choices that politicians have been framed as economic growth and maintaining the economy versus dealing with the virus. What we've actually seen is that the countries that dealt with the virus best and suppressed it have had by far the best economic outcomes. And I think there's a really clear analogy there with climate change, that economic and environmental sustainability will support and augment one another. And if you imagine a world where we don't act on climate change, that is not an economically sustainable world, because what you will see is collapse of certain sectors and parts of the economy as the impacts of climate change become clear. The second message, I think, is about getting ahead. The consumers and voters are worried about this. They are going to demand change, and they are demanding change. And I think when you remember that chart I showed you with Orsted and Vestas and the success they've had over the last few years, the companies that are in the forefront of those new sectors are going to be the ones who benefit most from this transition. The ones who are laggards are either going to lose value, or in some cases, this is a genuinely existential threat to their business models. And then the last point I'd make is that this has to be a whole organization transition. So when I was dealing with companies on this stuff 10 years ago, I was always talking to the CSR director. This was seen very much, as part of social responsibility. By the end of that time in government, I was talking to strategy directors and board level people, and you may well be seeing that transition happening within your organizations as well. And I think the key thing there really for governments as well as for businesses is that this has to be absolutely fundamental to strategy across the board. So just to finish up, people quite often ask me whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic on this agenda, because there is a lot to do, it's fair to say, but I am optimistic. I think we can solve this problem. And one of the strange kind of paradoxes of climate change is people who argue that we can solve this problem if we get on with it are often presented as the pessimists, because we're talking about climate catastrophe and so on. But actually, I think human ingenuity, the forces that markets can bring to bear if governments get the framework right, can really enable us to tackle this problem. And I think they're going to very, very quickly over the last 10 years. So Tom, I'll stop there and share my screen, and then we can open up to Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. That was a really excellent, fascinating presentation. And from my perspective, I mean, you and I had a discussion about this, but I do feel one of the challenges has been trying to translate what is a seemingly global intractable problem into a kind of local solution. People understanding, what is it that I have to do? What will my lifestyle look like in a net zero world? So yeah, really interesting to hear your perspectives on that, and also to hear your positivity, actually, because I think the whole agenda, it does need optimism. It does need positivity in order to get things done. We've had a few questions starting to filter through. So a reminder to people, please do submit your questions via the Q&A function. And just while those are building up, I'm going to take the liberty as chairperson of asking you a quick question of my own, Tim. I obviously not really the focus of your presentation today, but I suppose the thing people will always say, or perhaps the naysayers will say, is that all of these things are great. We've got a great plan, great targets, we can do this, but we are one nation of 150 odd or whatever it is nations in the world, and one of the smallest. So what are your perspectives on the sort of global picture, and maybe it's part of your work with the Tony Blair Institute, I don't know, but what's your view on that, and the role that we as a nation can play and should play in helping to sort of take global action?
Yeah, sure. But I think this is a really big year on the global stage, right? Because we had the Paris Agreement in 2015. We were due to be holding COP26 here in the UK last December. And that got last November, and that got moved to this November. Now that move, actually, I think, although it was for unfortunate reasons, was a very good thing, because what it's meant is that you've had Biden in the White House, and you've had other countries able to spend a bit more time figuring out what they should do with their targets and their level of ambition. And so, while the UK is only 1% of global emissions, I think first of all, you've seen the US target is pretty ambitious. China has set a net zero 2060 target. India is rumored to be considering similar. The EU, I mentioned all these countries earlier, and that is a very, very clear signal about where global markets are going. So while the UK does have a moral responsibility, we have emitted a huge amount of CO2 over the last 200 years, and I think we're still 5th in the world in terms of total CO2 emissions. It isn't just about the kind of moral responsibility case, although that's important. It's also about the fact that global markets are going to move in this direction really quickly. So if you don't get in the front of that, then you're going to be, someone once said to me, you don't want to be manufacturing the last diesel engine in Europe. You want to be in the forefront of the EV transition in the automotive sector. In the financial services space, green finance used to be like a little niche that was sort of looked at as a kind of slightly odd part of the sector and a bit nerdy. Whereas what you're now seeing is that that's fundamentally altering the investment strategies of the big pension funds, big investment funds. So I think the UK, we do have a moral responsibility. In fact, I think we genuinely can be influential in this stuff, and it is a really important part of our global brand. And our global brand hasn't necessarily done that well over the last 5 years or so, but in this space, at least, we can genuinely claim to be global leaders. But also, for me, fundamentally, it's about the economic argument and the fact that if the global economy is going in this direction, we need to be ahead of that and go with it, as opposed to laggards.
Thanks. Turning to some of the questions then. The first one we've had is from Chris Nicholson. He says, Tim, you rightly highlighted some of the reasons for hope: more ambitious targets, the growth in onshore wind, tumbling costs, and the growth of electric cars. But the hard decisions aren't being made. We are forecast to miss the 4th and 5th carbon budgets, and they were set on an 80% 2050 target. We are way off doing what we need to do on the home energy efficiency and domestic heating, and on issues like petrol excise duty freezes, hard decisions aren't being made. What can be done on this?
Yeah, so I think that's a very fair question, because if I look back 10 years ago at the climate debate, it was essentially between people who argued that we shouldn't act on climate change, it wasn't real, and then people who argued that we should act on climate change, kind of irrespective of cost, and then politicians were trying to figure out a way through the middle. I actually think what you've seen now is that the centre ground has fragmented a lot. So climate deniers, people who don't believe the science, are basically very, very marginal in this debate now. But the question really is, do we only do the things that are obviously win-win now, or do we make some of the tougher choices? And I think what you've seen with the government now is that they have, to their credit, set really, really ambitious targets, genuinely, continuing to be world leading. They have done some important stuff in different parts of the economy. So, they've said they're going to ban petrol and diesel vehicle sales by 2030. That's very ambitious. It's the most ambitious target of any country with a significant automotive sector. They're doing really ambitious stuff in the power sector, but they're also presenting this all as win-win. And it isn't all as simple as that. And in particular, I think in home heating and in heavy industry, there are some really tough choices that have to be made. And I think the key thing for me is about building the political case around all of this stuff. As I said earlier, you can't expect members of the public to get heat pumps without A, explaining to them why they need them and why it matters, B, getting the economics around that right. Gas is currently really cheap and electricity is relatively expensive, for example. And third, giving them really clear foresight about where this market is going, that they can have the confidence to invest when they're doing home renovations or they're buying or selling houses or they're changing their boiler or whatever it happens to be. And I think in particular in those sectors, I think it's right that government does have to start fronting up with the public a bit more in terms of what this transition means, making the positive case for it and setting a really clear policy framework that investors at all levels, right, from the kind of biggest investment funds right down to the average householder, can do the things that they need to do to cut emissions.
Okay, thank you. The next question we have is from Stephen Glaister. His question is, what role do you see for reforming taxation? You noted the massive problem of the need to persuade householders to replace gas-fired heating, point you've obviously just touched upon. And you pointed out that most don't understand, but domestic gas has a concession and only carries 5% VAT. So, well, yeah, what are your views on the taxation element of this?
Yeah, so I think it's a really important part of the picture. I don't think it's the only part of the picture. Some people argue that what you need is an economy-wide, ideally a global carbon price, and then we can all kind of pack up and go home, and that will deliver the outcome we need. And I think, in theory, that's probably true, but it's not going to happen on the kind of timescales that we need. So I think what we need to do is be looking more at incentives in particular sectors and designing our response to that in a way that works for those sectors. I do think there's a lot more the tax system can do. There was some research out last week from the Green Alliance. I think Peter Foster wrote it up in the FT, which said people are ready for this. People are up for more environmental taxation. Now, you've got to treat that with salt, because if you say to people, do you think polluters should pay more for their pollution, then they'll say yes. If you say you're a polluter and it's your gas boiler that's causing the pollution, you'll probably get a slightly different answer, I suspect. But I think there are really important reforms we need to make. So the first is around gas and electricity pricing. So at the moment, all of the cost of renewables essentially are placed onto electricity bills and none of them onto gas bills. And what that means is you've ended up with a very counterintuitive situation where the fuel cleanest and that we want to get people onto, i.e. electricity, is taxed in effect much more heavily than the fuel that's causing greenhouse gas emissions and that we want to get people off in terms of natural gas. And I think rebalancing that is not a whole solution, but I think it's a really important part of the solution. The second area I'd highlight is around fuel duty, where at the moment we get about 30 billion quid a year from fuel duty. That's a lot of money. That's the equivalent of about 6p on income tax. That money is going in the next 15 years or so, because the transition to EVs is going to happen really, really quickly. And I think people have underestimated that. And if you don't do something about that, you're going to lose 30 billion quid. You're going to have more congestion because driving will be a lot cheaper. And we're already one of the most congested countries in the world. And you're going to be in a situation where the wealthier people who can afford new vehicles, which will be electric, will be paying 5 pence a mile to drive, whereas the rest of the population is going to be paying 15 pence a mile to drive. And I don't think that's politically sustainable because it's clearly unfair. So I do think we have to look in particular sectors at the role of taxation and also be collaborating globally in some areas, in particular around industrial emissions, because while the costs are not necessarily prohibitive of decarbonising industry, the competitiveness impacts are potentially significant. So in one or two areas, we do need to be looking globally at how we manage that.
Just picking up on one of those points, do you see road pricing, national road pricing, which is now being talked about again as part of the policy mix?
So I do, and I think we're doing some work on that at the moment. As I say, that road price, I mean, Tony Blair actually looked at that in sort of 2007, and they moved away from it. There was a very concerted campaign on it. But the world's very different now in the sense that, as I say, that £30 billion is going. And there's nothing that, and it isn't going for climate change reasons. It's going because EVs are going to be cheaper and better and a better consumer proposition than petrol and diesel vehicles. And as I say, the do nothing in that, lose the money, more congestion, unfair. So you have to do something about that. And in my view, a form of road pricing has to be the way that you do it. But in terms of how you design it, it goes back to the point that I made before about the level of foresight and strategic thinking you need. Because if you kind of just wait for that problem to arise and then try and deal with it very quickly, you're going to have a very big problem. If you can deal with it on a sort of 10 to 15 year time scale, so when I buy an EV, I know what road pricing on that is going to be over time, and it might increase over time, for example. And that means that you can hopefully manage some of those politics a bit better. But you also need to articulate the positive case for change. You need to maybe look at how you're recycling some of those revenues to the poorest in society, or the people who are most affected by that change. And also you need to be articulating wider benefits on your air quality, on reduced congestion, and all those kind of things. But I do think that we are going to have to move in that direction in the next few years.
Change of direction with the next question. Good question, interesting question from Darl Sweetland, which is, hi Tim, do you think HS2 is a faster horse? I might just expand on that question, Tim, and just ask for your perspectives. We as a law firm, one of our specialist areas is major infrastructure planning in transport and energy, and the embedded CO2 is increasingly a big consideration with those projects. So I suppose perhaps wrapped up in this question is that issue, seeing a lot of these cases come before the courts as well. So it'd be interesting to hear your perspectives on the development of major infrastructure in the context of reaching net zero.
Sure. So yeah, good question on HS2. So I'm not an HS2 expert, and I know you have to be careful what you say, or I know there's very strong views on HS2. I guess my general view is that the carbon case for HS2 is really about freeing up capacity on other lines, and UK rail infrastructure is not great, and HS2 can play a really big role in increasing capacity, getting more passengers onto the rail as opposed to the road, and crucially getting more freight. So overall, I'm not sure it is a faster horse. I think it potentially could be an important part of the mix. I think the tricky thing about it is, in particular in terms of passenger capacity, is how does society in general respond to COVID, and how does that affect how we move around, which I think is quite hard to anticipate. I think on the broader question about kind of infrastructure investment, I mean, this is a really difficult area. As you say, there's been a lot of legal activity on this. Because on the one hand, there is no single infrastructure project that's net zero incompatible. Remember one of my early slides, it said, we are going to have some emissions in 2050. We're going to need to offset those. You can do some high carbon things, in your economy at that point. But on the other hand, you can't have all of them. So you might be able to develop one airport, but you can't develop all of them, because otherwise you'll have too many people flying. And I think that is a big challenge. My own view is that the planning system at the moment is still a few years behind where the technology is and where the net zero debate is. And I suspect the government's going to have to look at the planning framework and the context in which decisions are being made, because the risk otherwise is everything gets legally challenged, and that has a huge chilling effect on all investments, including the ones that we need to deliver net zero.
Thanks. Then we've had a question from Ben Rattenbury. Says, excellent presentation, Tim. Thank you. You mentioned the growing investment case for low carbon with the example of the price to earnings ratio for Vestas, Ørsted versus Shell and BP. But that chart also illustrates the risk of low carbon companies being overvalued with too much green capital suddenly chasing too few viable green investments. Tesla is arguably the most overvalued company on the planet, looking at its core financials. So what's your response to concerns about this potential green bubble?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really fair point, and actually that is the flip side of that chart, is that is there a kind of tulip fever around green investment? How long is that going to last? I guess my view would be, first of all, there aren't enough companies doing the right kinds of things, and obviously the investor appetite is there. And so if I was in at the same sector, but perhaps at the higher carbon end of it, I'd be looking at that and thinking there's probably enough to go round here when you look at how investors are piling in to some of those green companies. I mean, the second thing I'd say is that the wider market fundamentals, so in particular, global commitments from the US and China and so on that I've already talked about, mean that this market is going to continue to grow. And so what you're seeing is, in some cases, immaturity of markets, or a lack of investable propositions which are doing the kinds of things we need to do for net zero. So I think the more important thing there in some ways is the signal that's sending to others in the market, that there's enough of this capital, there's enough capital to go round here, and that actually investors are really looking for opportunities in this space.
I guess a related point from Chris Gray, related question. How much should carbon pricing drive the dynamics?
Yeah, I think I'll try not to repeat what I said before, because I think, as I say, it has a role. I think you have to tailor it depending on the sector of the economy that you're talking about. I think probably the most interesting areas I mentioned is around industrial emissions. So, in fact, decarbonising in heavy industry, so steel, cement, and so on and so forth, doesn't actually have a huge cost in terms of the end user. So I think on a can of Coke, it's like 0.1 pence or something to do it with completely zero carbon materials. The problem is that that's your profit margin. And if you are the country which goes for green steel or green cement or a green chemical industry or whatever, you're operating in quite a tight margin industry, and others will outcompete you. So I think that is an area where we have to look at carbon pricing. See, things like emissions trading systems can help with that. But I think also that there's a very live debate at the moment around carbon border adjustments in particular. I do think something like that is almost certainly going to be needed. If we look at, say, the UK, we've got a great story around reducing emissions from our territorial emissions from the UK. When you look at our wider carbon footprint, it's higher, and people not unreasonably argue we need to be getting carbon out of everything that we do. And I think things like global carbon pricing or carbon border adjustments, emissions trading systems, which price that carbon, potentially have a really important role to play. But I do think we need to be careful about people who argue, well, we just need to wait for a global carbon price, are essentially arguing we're not going to do anything to solve this problem. That isn't going to happen kind of cross economy globally on the kind of timescales that we need.
Mm. Thank you. We've then had a question from Kelvin McDonald. Brilliant talk, Tim, with great slides. He says, unlike Local Agenda 21 in the past, there does not seem to be a lot of emphasis in the current debates and actions on the role of local government as opposed to central government in driving the path to net zero. Do you think this is a gap in the debate?
So I would just say emphatically yes. I think from a couple of perspectives. One is kind of who is responsible for emissions, particularly in the UK and particularly in England. Actually, our governance is a mess. You've got huge number of different governance structures in different parts of the country. We metropolitan mayors and unitary authorities and blah blah blah. But it's not really clear what they're responsible for in this space. Many of them are setting really ambitious targets, but they don't have the levers available to them to meet those targets. The second perspective is that our understanding of the energy system is actually pretty poor. When you look at real understanding around local energy systems and how they work, what are they going to need in terms of infrastructure investment and reinforcement at local level? If we're decarbonising heating with electricity and transport with electricity, we're going to need very different local energy systems, because if everyone puts their heat pump on a cold day while they're charging their EVs and the system falls over, that's a pretty big problem. And I think much better mapping of local energy systems. And what you can then do is start thinking about what does the net zero transition look like in a particular area? And that might vary a bit depending on urban versus rural, depending on proximity to low carbon hydrogen production and all kinds of other things. And I think there's quite an urgent need actually for central government, but not just central government, to be thinking about what does our energy system look like in quite a granular way? What does the housing stock look like? Etc. And what does that decarbonisation journey look like for different parts of the country? Because otherwise you're just going to have an issue where local politicians are setting really ambitious targets without the levers to meet them, and central government is designing nationwide policy solutions that don't work for everyone.
That links nicely into the next question we've had from Dr. John Pritchard, which is a question about heat pumps. He says, domestically, what do you anticipate in balance between ground source and air source heat pumps? Concerns over the health impacts on air source, noise pollution, dust levels, irritation levels. Most people do not like air source heat pumps, whether in offices or homes. What about district heating or waste schemes instead, popular in Japan, but scarcely seen in this country?
Yeah, so on heat pumps, I mean, I think it's a much longer conversation, and it's a corner of Twitter that I'd encourage you to go and have a look at, because there's some pretty visceral views on hydrogen versus heat pumps, and then which types of heat pumps people prefer and so on. I'm sure John's familiar with all of that. I mean, my view is that air source heat pumps are probably going to do the majority of the heavy lifting in that space. I think there's quite a lot to be done in terms of the acceptability of that technology, the design of that technology. But when you start moving, but in order to address that, we're going to need to give a clearer idea of market size and enable that sector to develop very quickly. I mean, I think in terms of the numbers I've seen, actually, people who have heat pumps, broadly speaking, are in favour of them and would recommend them to others. I think it's about 80% or so. So they're not necessarily unpopular, but I think there is a huge amount to be done in terms of the supply chain, both for the product and for the installation and for use of them. And I think there are real risks around that. In terms of local heat networks and district heating and so on, I think that's a really important part of the mix. One of the risks is that you tend to think nationally and you think, right, are we going to go for electrification or hydrogen? And actually the answer is probably you might principally do electrification in my view, but there will almost certainly be a role, and quite a significant role, for heat networks and potentially for hydrogen as well in some parts of the country. So as you say, in some ways it links back to the previous point around what does the local transition look like, because I think it's probably going to be different for different parts of the country.
Thank you. We've had a question from a colleague of mine, Alice Unwin, in our charities team. She's mentioned that there's a growing number of environmental and conservation charities directly involved in this area, and perhaps more significantly, charities across the spectrum are increasingly aligning their investment portfolios with environmental, social governance and impact credentials. But is there a broader role for the charity sector to play, perhaps in collaboration with the corporate sector? So interested to hear your views on that.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, first of all, just to say about environmental NGOs, I know the question's broader than that, but it's worth saying environmental NGOs have played a huge role in all of this, because while they're always asking for more, and that can drive politicians a bit mad in my experience, when you look at where we've got to, so in 2017, not a single party mentioned net zero in its manifesto. By 2019, we had a legislated net zero target, and 95% of voters supported parties committed to net zero. That happened because of the NGO movement. So I think, or to a large degree because of the NGO movement, and I think it can be a huge force for good and for change. I think in terms of the charity sector more broadly, I mean, I guess a couple of thoughts, or I suspect Alice knows much more about it than me. The first is the power of their investment portfolios, and I think that is a really important point, that are they really properly aligned with ESG? Are they really properly aligned with net zero fundamentally, and are they looking hard at the companies that they're supporting either directly or indirectly, and do they have not just a net zero target, but a credible plan for meeting that target and for cutting emissions in the short term? The second thing is about communication, because I talked a bit about the behavior change and the way that this is going to affect consumers. Consumers need to understand this stuff better, but government is not necessarily the right communicator or messenger on all of this. Government needs to set the framework, and it certainly has a role in it, but actually often it's charities, it's companies and organizations which are much more trusted than central government on all of this stuff. And so I think charities have a really, really important role in terms of the kind of hearts and minds piece, and in terms of being trusted communicators.
Thanks. Question from Dean Somerville. It says, great talk to him, many thanks. On carbon border adjustments, there is some discussion that they could undermine global emissions reductions, particularly around climate negotiations in this pivotal time for accelerating all countries' actions on climate. Do you have a view on the right way to proceed with the UK as the COP hosts? Yeah,
I think that's a really fair point from Dean, and this is kind of the next big thing in some ways, but I think you do need to be quite cautious about it. I mean, I think a couple of things. One is, I don't think we should be too ambitious on carbon border adjustments for COP. I think there's a lot of work to do, and I think some agreement around principles is probably the right way to go here. While I've talked a lot about how quick this transition needs to be, I do think there's a huge amount to do there. I think the second thing is we need to think quite hard about global justice on all of this stuff. If you put in place carbon border adjustment, in effect, prevents sub-Saharan Africa from growing its economy because it's suddenly priced out of it, then I think that's a big problem. So I think the way that we might treat carbon border adjustments in context with our trading relationship with the EU might look very different to the way we look at it in the context of our trading arrangements with Africa and with the global South. And I think there's quite a lot of work to do there about how you can design that in a way that A, gets the incentives right, and B, is fair and kind of politically sustainable from a kind of global perspective. And for COP26, I think we need to be a little bit careful that we're not advocating for something that we haven't really collectively thought through yet. Thanks. I suppose returning to a point that I mentioned earlier, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about the Tony Blair Institute's work overseas. I mean, is this an area that you actively get involved in terms of advisory work and working with other countries around some of these issues? So it is, yeah. So we do a bunch of different things. So the bit of the organisation I work in is mainly UK focused, around kind of progressive politics in the UK. But we also do a lot of work as you say, in Africa. And I think one of the key learnings we take from that, working very closely with governments and with people investing in Africa, is two things really. One is kind of energy access is hugely important and a huge challenge when you think, you know, the numbers of people in the African continent who don't currently have access to reliable energy supplies, and you have to. There's a risk sometimes that we take a very Western perspective to this, and that, you know, well, we can do offshore wind and we can do all kinds of things here because we've got an electricity grid structure and regulatory structure that enables that, and also that our demand is quite stable in the sense that our population is fairly stable. We're not urbanizing very rapidly and so on, and that challenge is very, very different in Africa. The second is about what does growth look like, because from an African perspective, this cannot be an agenda which cuts emissions but also cuts economic growth off at the knee. Growing populations with very, very low per capita income and also very, very low emissions per capita as well. We have to be, I think, doing a lot more work, not just in TBI, which we will be doing, but more broadly about what does this transition actually look like for Africa and for the global South more broadly from an economic perspective, and how can we, you know, take the kind of clean growth narrative and build back better or whatever, and apply that in a context for countries which currently have very low GDP and who have every right to expect to be able to consume and to be able to grow their economies.
Thanks. We're nearly at the end of our allotted time, so I'll perhaps finish with one question from me to you, Tim. It's been an excellent presentation, and you know, the ambitions there, the targets there. But in your view, I mean, I guess the question now is, you know, what's the plan? Where are the plans? So you know, what is the one thing that government really needs to do now to sort of accelerate this process that you've talked about in transition to net zero? Where's the work really needed, if it's easy to distill it into one core thing?
I mean, I think so. The government said it's going to publish a net zero strategy before COP26. I think that's the kind of the key thing, because what we've had is a lot of sort of sectoral strategies and individual sectoral targets and so on, some of which are ambitious enough, some of which need more work. But what we really need to see is how does this fit together? What is the kind of overall blueprint for how the UK gets to its 2030 target, 2035 and 2050? And as part of that, the key thing for me is the last point made in the presentation about this being a whole organisation effort. When I was in government, you know, often it felt like you were pushing water uphill a bit on this stuff. I think that's changed a lot actually, and to the credit of many people. But this has to be not the third, fourth, fifth priority for the Department for Transport or for DEFRA or whoever. It has to be in the top priority, because there are some difficult trade-offs here. And I think the net zero strategy is probably the big opportunity for government to set out what those trade-offs look like, how it's going to manage it, and also set a vision, and a positive vision for how we get to our targets and what a net zero society looks like.
Thanks, Tim. So we've reached, or just about reached we have reached the end of our allotted time. So we'll draw things to a close there. Many thanks to you, Tim. As I say, that was an absolutely fascinating presentation, and thanks to everyone for listening and asking some really great questions as well. So we'll wish you an enjoyable day and hope to see you again at one of our future business breakfast. Many thanks.